Team Fortress 2 is practically unplayable, entirely infested with cheating bots that will instantly kill any human player that enters their line of sight. Yeah, I get it, TF2 is an old game, no one at Valve wants to work on it, but as long as they're still adding microtransactions to the game that you are expected to spend money on, I don't think it's entirely unreasonable that the TF2 player base expects the game to be, playable. From what I hear, CSGO 2 isn't faring much better in that regard, and it seems Valve's making a new live service game in Deadlock. Who knows, maybe this will be the game Valve just doesn't neglect. If you haven't already, feel free to sign the Fix TF2 petition linked below. Apparently they're gonna be physically hand-delivering them to Valve's headquarters. Worth a shot, I guess, but, practically it's probably not gonna do anything. But enough about those bots, let's talk about another bot. Mimi Sentry, an anthropomorphized version of Engineer's Mini Sentry. When modeling, it can often be useful to consider how the object would be constructed physically in life. That'll usually give you a good idea of how to make it digitally. For example, even though Mimi's torso is actually separate articulated segments, its form is continuous and flowing across all the pieces. So I opted to form her torso in the early stages of the sculpt as a single solid mesh, later using Boolean operations to separate her torso into segments as needed. And that's probably a good time to get into the differences between sculpting and edge modeling. While you could totally sculpt Mimi's entire body, it would sort of be a waste of time. Different modeling techniques have different pros and cons. I opted to use sculpting to capture the feminine forms of the torso, in this case, but for almost everything else in this model, I found it easier to box or edge model it. As a general rule of thumb, if it's an organic form, it should be sculpted. If it's a mechanical form, it probably should be edge or box modeled. Faces are probably one of the more tricky things to get right in a model. Humans are hardwired to see faces in everything, and hardwired to see any flaws in them. My basic workflow for faces usually goes something like this. Nail down the general head shape. From there, create an eye socket. Put an eyeball or an eye plane in that eye socket. Then, add in the eyelashes. Eyelashes are incredibly important. Characters that don't have them look uncanny, so it's important to add them to your sculpt before you start trying to fix your sculpt. In a similar vein, you must block in your hair. Oftentimes, hair helps define a character's silhouette, and when the hair is not there, they're just not gonna look like the character. The general gist here is you have to block out the entire character before you start trying to make your model look more like the character. Otherwise, you're gonna be tweaking and fixing things that aren't wrong, or are only wrong because you're missing details. In Mimi's original model, the right hand was just the sentry's head, which was always another sticking point for me. It seemed kind of clunky to me. It limited a lot of her actions. If she was doing anything that required any sort of dexterity, it had to be done with her left hand. There was no getting around that. And it seemed very limiting on animators. So in her rig, I decided to add in a control that would swap her hand into a sentry dynamically, which I think should help with that issue a lot more. A general principle of modeling is to start out simple and add details or complexities as needed. You can see areas here start out low poly and gradually get more polys as I start to refine them and add in details. Things like sharpening edge bevels or smoothing out surfaces, stuff like that. If you add in these details too early, it becomes very difficult to refine the model if you have to make tweaks to it. And on that note, my favorite feature is how the Mini Sentry's flashing light is sort of fashioned into like this headband thing. And with those sculpts done, it is now on to Retopology. Retopology is a bitch, alright? It's the worst part about modeling, hands down. But where there's sculpting, there is also retopology. That's the price you pay for the freedom sculpting allows. Retopology is the process of converting a high-resolution, messy sculpt to an optimized mesh that can be better used for rigging and texturing. With box modeling or edge modeling, you're thinking about your form and topology at the same time, and you complete them at the same time. But with sculpting, you're choosing to think about your topology later in favor of focusing on your form now. Now with the final clean model created, we must prepare for texturing. We need to create two things, UV maps and an ID mask. An ID mask is just a color map that allows you to easily mask out parts of the model for painting. Not necessary, but it greatly speeds up the process. And a UV map is a 2D representation of your model's surface. Since we have a couple of areas on the model that use a checkerboard pattern, I'm going to make it so much easier for myself to texture that part by forcing those UV islands to be square on the grid, rather than how they would normally unwrap. The main downside to doing this is you're going to get a mismatch in pixel density. There will be more pixels up here at the top where they're all being squished in together, which is generally not a good idea, but for this specific purpose, it's fine. The time we save hand painting a grid pattern is well worth the trade-off. Aside from that, texturing is pretty straightforward for Mimi. Simple solid colors with edge highlights and paint chipped off, revealing bare metal underneath. I wasn't really trying to match how TF2 models are textured one-to-one, so I just kind of focused on extrapolating the details seen in Mimi's texture sheet. Now with her textures all set up, it's time to start rigging her. Thankfully with a robot, you don't have to do much weight painting at all. You just parent the different body segments to the correct bone. However, the trade-off for that is you often have to do more rig tricks to automate the more mechanical stuff. Such as what I did in the shoulder area here. There's a lot going on here in the shoulder area. You have the socket the arm connects to. You have a strap, and you have the metal undershirt. I want the strap and the undershirt part to follow the shoulders movement, but not entirely. I want there to be a little bit of an offset. I created a few duplicates of her shoulder bone and made them copy the shoulder bone's rotation at a lower influence, giving this nice effect here on the shoulder. And I also added in a control to swap Mimi's hand to a Sentry, or vice versa. This is a lot more simple to do than it looks. It's literally just a slider that plays an animation on the rig. But hey, whatever works. Once the rig is done, it's just a matter of adding in some nice quality of life features, such as a pose library, proxy bone picker, and rig layers, but that stuff's not really all that interesting to watch, so just take my word for it, I guess. With all that said, I think the project turned out rather well, the main goal here just being to create an updated version of the original model with more features, and I think it succeeded on that front. I've been wanting to create a model of Mimi for a while, and, and felt this was good an opportunity to do it as any. And after a combined 22 hours of work, she's done. And ready. It's ready for all your Mimi Sentry related needs. All of them.
I will fuck the shit out of that robot, man. I'm not even...
Also, Valve, fix your fucking game!